Caroline Davis, saxophonist, flutist, composer, improviser, educator, researcher. Anything else?
You got it. Got all of it.
That's cool. So, looking forward to talking about your new album, Portals, and a bunch of other stuff. Before we get to that, though, I just wanted to ask my sort of icebreaker question that I always ask everybody to get a visceral window into your soul. And that's, can you tell me about coffee in your life? And I hear that you do espressos.
Yes, I love espresso so much. I didn't start drinking coffee till probably, I don't know, maybe 5 years ago. It wasn't a thing for
Hmm,
me. And I've actually never liked it because of the coffee itself. And that sounds really maybe privileged. But the first time I ever had it and was interested in it, my dad encouraged me to get this espresso in Italy, because
mhm.
he was living in Switzerland and it was very close to the border. So we drove there and had an espresso, and I was like, wow, this is what coffee tastes like. And I just didn't really know. And so then I tried to go back to drinking coffee, or I tried to go back and have a coffee, and I was like, this isn't what coffee tastes like. And then I realized, oh, espresso and coffee are different things, and they have different caffeine content. And so then I got an espresso machine in the pandemic, and we've been
Nice.
making shots. And it's really a science. And maybe
Absolutely. Yeah.
I know about that too, but and my partner's been teaching me a lot. He knows more than me, but like make sure that you use the scale to measure out all of the grinds and
So
make sure.
y'all are serious.
Yeah, and the grinder we have is okay. It's probably like middle of the line. We should get a better grinder, but it's middle of the line because we could just get that with the funds that we had. But yeah, we weigh out the stuff and we try to get the fresh grounds or correct fresh beans, and it's really amazing how older beans are a certain weight. I'm just starting to get into that.
Mhm. Do you have like a roaster that you like?
Actually, no, I haven't really checked out the roasters around here, but I should. I should. We get our coffee beans. Sometimes we get the Cafe Grumpy. They're at the co-op that we go to in Park Slope.
Nice.
Window. People are starting to do construction. But yeah, we get it at our co-op, and I think sometimes it's Brooklyn Roasting Company, and then wherever Cafe Grumpy gets their beans, sometimes we'll splurge and get those. But yeah, a friend of mine who's an incredible bass player, Michael Bates, maybe you've heard of him. He
Mhm.
has a coffee grinder. Sorry, roasting. He has roasts his own beans in his house, which is amazing. So I'm still kind of waiting to try those.
Nice. Yeah, I love the sort of coffee nerddom. So I'm glad that y'all are using a scale and doing it right and stuff.
Yeah,
Um,
we're
cool.
trying.
Cool.
Maybe someday we'll get more fancy, but
Well, okay. I guess we can talk about music too. So your new album, Portals, Volume One and Morning. I'm just first of all curious: is there like a Volume Two in the works already, or is it kind of like a placeholder to put a volume on it?
I'm gonna do volume two, and I have another record that I've recorded already, but it's not volume two for Portals. This is a different project with Val Janti and Chris Tordini and Taishan Sori.
That's it.
Um, and I'm hoping also to involve Kasem Nakvi on some of the overdubs for modular synth. So that's like a different kind of a album based on all of the freedom fighters I've been following over the years. But anyway,
Cool.
volume two, I'm working on currently sketching ideas, and I'll be working with Nicole Mitchell on the compositions. And so I was able to get this grant through Chamber Music America to work with her
Nice.
to help shape my compositions and as a mentor. And so that volume, I would like to feature different vocalists and still the same band that I have now with Marquise Hill and Julian Shore and Chris Tordini and Alan Bennard. But yeah,
Awesome.
volume
Cool.
two coming.
Well, so the album, it's an album of mourning, and that's like a very rich sort of emotional space. And like I've been trying to explain musical set theory to my dad, and trying to like be like, it's not about like majors happy and minors sad. It's about like these like different shapes of triangles and stuff. And so like I feel like you have influence from psychology and all that. So I'm curious, how do you map sort of like a complex and rich emotional landscape into the music? I mean, that's a big question, but I'm just curious where that go, makes your mind go.
Oh yeah. Well, I think a lot of that where I came from for that record was me processing this grief in this in a certain way, and I didn't realize. I feel like sometimes we get into spaces and we don't know what's going on and it's very confusing, but then later we understand we understand better what was going on. And for me, I was journaling a lot and thinking about how grief is a texture. So
Mm,
I was kind of thinking about like prickly. The end texture was prickly, and then sort of early on, it was really soft for me and like very plush and lush, and the feeling of that joy of feeling soft pillows and soft, that was really helpful at the beginning stages for me. And then I was really interested in like touching roughness, and it sounds kind of like self pain inflicting, but like rubbing my hand up against a rock or just kind of
mhm.
shredding a little bit into my hand, which is, yeah, I mean, it just for some reason, and I know a lot of people who deal with like depression and you know, in moments where they do want to hurt themselves, it's to sort of like subdue the other pain that they're experiencing. And so it
Mm,
kind of
mhm.
thought about that in that stage of me feeling, you know, grief for my dad's passing. Um, and then there was this sort of thing where I really wanted to be in water, which happens to me a lot. Like I really want to be inside water. I want to take a bath. I want to go swimming. I want to go into the ocean. I want to put my hand in water. And so those four textures were really dominating the emotional state space of where I was, if that makes sense.
Totally, yeah. Sorry, the four textures are water, plushness, prickliness, and or
Like harsh. So it was,
okay,
yeah, to me it
oh,
was
the coarseness of the like the rock.
yeah, soft and prickly and slippery was the yeah, slippery wet, and then
Okay.
rough and hard stone kind of stuff. And so I tried to put some of those elements in the album, but it's not very more that's a performative thing for me. So I'm working on using that model in our performance. And so we had one show with the whole ensemble, and we were using a set design, which was great, and those fabrics in the set design.
Oh, very
And
cool.
I plan to do another performance in December where we'll be more specifically working with other fabrics in the performance of the pieces. So, and this will be able to be spread out more because we'll be at Roulette, so it's going to be a huge space, and we'll be able to do that there. But yeah, for me, the emotive state of music comes in the form of texture or density. So something can be I guess a lot of people or some people think about happy and sad, but for me, it's more like heavy or light, or I mean, if you want to think in terms of binaries, but I'm also trying to, as the rest of the world is, step away from
Right.
the binary model. So I'm trying to sort of think about things as a spectrum of experience.
Gotcha.
So this is kind of veering towards the the harshness, or this is veering towards the density of an experience, or this is dealing and moving towards the lightness of an experience. But I'm still kind of in the middle, and so I'm trying to vary my understanding of the state in terms of like spectrum instead of I'm all the way over here or over here.
Right.
And that has a lot to do with sort of my foray into my dad was Buddhist, and so I'm trying to
Oh,
understand a little bit more of that, but like this middle path, that concept of the middle path of being centered, where you have a moment where you're going to totally lose it over here. And then over here, you're really on high, you're happy, and you're feeling good. But the middle, trying not to like veer in either direction and just kind of just staying in the middle. But that's so hard. So
hmm, totally.
musically, musically and emotionally, yeah.
When you say like textural, I guess I think of like timbre. And so I'm curious on like the level of like pitches and like organizing sort of like formal stuff instead of like just like the texture of the timbre. Does that influence like your selection of tones, for instance, or like how do you think about how that influences harmony?
Well, yeah, wow, yeah, that's such a good question because there's so much there, and for me, I kind of think about that world when I'm more dealing with electronic music, or
Mhm.
if I'm working with like a synthesizer. In this other project, Alula, that was really great because I was able to use Matt Mitchell was using the Prophet for playing in that band, and I have one here. Well, actually, it's my partner's, but it's right here below. So I like to. There's so many. There's like hundreds of patches on that instrument, and each one has a different sort of profile. But I also have started. I'll be in Pro Tools, and I want to create a track, or I'm working on a track right now with this Oscillations project for dancers. And what I've been doing is I'll generate like a tone, a sine tone, and yeah, with those you have a lot of control because all of the harmonic frequencies are sort of flatlined into
Hmm.
one. Like if you were looking at the Fourier transformation, it would just be like, all of the bars would be the same. I believe they would all be the same, of the same value. Um, but it's helpful for me to hear those frequencies in relation to the oscillation project because then I can understand what frequencies are considered to be what frequencies sound like to us that
Hmm.
are sort of happening in here in the brain. So
Totally.
now I'm sort of getting into that world, and I got lost on your question.
That's okay. I'm just interested to hear you talk about it. Uh, okay, so I guess yeah, I was going to ask about Omar Khayyam, but I'm curious to hear you talk about oscillation type stuff and like the brainwaves thing, and like there's so much to that in like the phenomenology of different like alpha versus beta, and yeah, so it's interesting to hear you mention the Fourier transform and stuff. Okay, well, yeah, and now I'm lost on it too, but
Yeah, I was
so
wondering because I wanted to go back to your question because I can't remember what your question was before. But anyway, it's all.
texture
Oh yeah.
and selection of tones. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so yeah. So I guess yes, I've been thinking about um how I could potentially, well, yeah, I mean anyone can do this, but create tones with different Fourier profiles so that you can feel the harshness of a tone because this overtone is louder. And all kinds of people already have done this. It's just fun to sort of do it yourself and explore because that is how we get timbre, is
Mhm.
that this harmonic frequency is somehow, this the third harmonic frequency is louder, and so you're hearing this texture or this timbre.
Mhm. Um, so in your oscillation series, like you have these little graphs of like the polyrhythms and stuff, and I feel like a while ago I was like, oh yeah, man, polyrhythms are like chords, and like it's like the same stuff largely. Do you feel like you think of these oscillations like that, like they're kind of like very slow chords, or like is it derived from rhythm in your mind, or is it like totally separate?
Yeah, I think there's only a certain degree that you can sort of make these claims because the thing is that I'm dealing in the pitch realm, and so all of that affects how people are perceiving things. So the melodies are influencing you. Yeah, if I just had clicks and I just had the interactions of clicks that were potentially sounding like the clicks were potentially sounding like what's going on in the brain. Yeah, I'm not sure about how I could transform that or create that sound. But anyway, if I just had clicks, then might be more like the experience of like a brainwave in isolation. And then
Mhm.
I could, and because I went to visit a friend of mine's lab at the University of Connecticut in Stores, and his name is Ed Large, and he's doing really wonderful work there. He has a lab there called the Music Dynamics Lab and Dynamical Systems. So they're treating the activity of the brain and how it interacts with the world as a dynamic system. So it's constantly shifting and moving. And what was exciting to me to talk to him about is the papers that he's working on now in collaboration with another researcher, Psyche Louis, who is in Boston. They're working to see how gamma frequencies played to people's ears as they're also listening to music at the same
Mhm.
time. So you're listening to your music, but then you also have this gamma frequency, which is super low. It's like 30,
And what
like
is gamma
hertz.
30-ish, or
Kind of.
what's the?
Yeah, well, gamma has like low gamma, high, middle gamma, and high gamma. Gamma can kind of go, I feel like could probably go up to like in the 40s hertz.
Okay.
see different things all over the place, but I think it starts somewhere in the 20s and goes up to somewhere in the 40s, but it's unclear sometimes these buckets of frequencies because they're all called different things and some people
Right.
have different ideas. So anyway, but they're playing that frequency as they're listening to other music, and who they're working with are patients who have Alzheimer's, and what they're seeing is that they're starting to recover certain memories that they weren't able to before, and so they're using gamma frequencies as what they call music-based intervention. So it's a sort of healing technique for people who have this condition. And that is super exciting because
Yeah.
for Ed, I've seen so much work coming out of his lab. And that's so exciting to me. But then a lot of people, it kind of gets missed by the general public because a lot of people maybe don't understand it, or they don't know how it could be applied to a clinical situation, because that's usually what people want to see, you know? And that's
Hmm.
usually what the people who fund these research experiments want to see. So, I mean, just to kind of give you, which is an interesting idea to me, that all of this research stuff is kind of getting funded by benefactors and people who are interested, but they want to know how, it's going to help people, which is good.
Hmm.
But I also think there's a lot of other stuff going on in that world that is inaccessible to a lot of people because they just don't understand, or they don't know how to understand. So this is exciting to me.
Hmm. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Hamilton Morris. He's like a journalist that talks about like psychedelics and various psychoactive things, but he has this whole routine that he does about like drug legality, where he replaces drugs with music, and he's like, "This is so ridiculous because if you talk about it in terms of music, it sounds absurd." And the idea that music could like actually be an effective or affective technology like that to like be therapeutic is, I feel like when I first heard of that idea, I was like, oh yeah, but now it's like, yeah, absolutely, it can be. So that's really cool to hear about the gamma waves having some sort of recovery effect.
Yeah.
Um,
This person is is looking into like what kind, like like the mushroom kind of people.
yeah, just like all sorts of psychoactive compounds. But yeah, like I mean, he's very into like the legalization of everything, and it's just funny to put it in terms of music. Like, man, we're all sitting around listening to music. Like, we're just like not leaving the house, just sitting around listening to music all day. And like, yeah, that's much different than sitting around doing drugs all day. But in some ways, it's similar.
Yeah, I think it is because it allows certain electrical patterns to occur when
Hmm.
you're on these psychotropic experiences, then because it's just changing the chemistry, and so then changing the neurochemistry. So then I don't know the science behind that stuff, but I've read a couple things. But I feel like it helps then to change the rhythm of what's going on in there. And
Hmm.
I'm not sure if it's generally like faster or slower, or just more quick between different areas of the brain, or is it slower in certain regard, or does it take longer to travel? And yeah, all those questions are something I would love to look into, because I know people are pushing for microdosing and things like that to help with certain conditions that
Hmm.
people have, especially like on the side of depression. I've been noticing that microdosing is like a lot of people are pushing for that.
Hmm. Yeah, a lot of money to be made in that world. I like the idea of just like sort of giving somebody a frequency though, instead like pharmaco frequency. I don't know. But anyway,
Yeah,
so
and people do that. I think people do that with these binaural beats, but the
mhm.
issue with the binaural beats, I feel like, is that it's usually coupled with some kind of other, calming music, and then I'm not sure always about the variability of veritability, if it's veritable, if it's true that these frequencies are coming through underneath this other kind of music. And then also just sort of like sometimes I just want to listen to this frequency, and it's hard to find an app that will give you that. You usually have an app that will give you the frequency plus water, you
Yeah,
know,
yes,
or plus like
rain
birds
and yeah,
chirping or rain, yeah, like
yeah.
things which is fine. I mean, I'm not knocking it, it's
Mhm.
just wasn't something I was looking for. So I just
Yeah,
downloaded a frequency generator. So
I feel like I'm with you on that, and I just want the raw materials and without the sort of like new age accompaniment.
yeah, yeah.
um,
But I think it
what
helps. That helps some people, so I wouldn't knock it.
For sure, yeah. When you talked about these gamma waves having like a restorative effect, is that like an interference type of binaural thing, or is it just literally the frequency?
I think it's literally the frequency.
Interesting.
Yeah, because the concept behind binaural beats is that you're listening to two frequencies, right, in each one in each ear, and then you hear the difference tone, or you experience the difference tone. But yeah, with that study, I believe that they were just straight up using gamma frequencies.
Interesting.
Yeah. So that paper, yeah, you can find. I can't remember the first author on the paper, but if whoever's listening, you can look up Ed Large, Psyche Louis, uh, Alzheimer's gamma. You'll find that paper. It's out there. It was published last year. So
Awesome. Well, I'll put it in the show notes.
yeah.
Um, so I saw you mention on Instagram Omar Khayyam, which I wasn't aware of him either. But it sounds like he was this Persian mathematician, polymath, sort of poet. And like I love the idea of like poetry and math sort of being like something that one person could do as like their things.
Mm.
Um, so I'm curious how this like poetry and all that like was able to seep in. And you mentioned like the spoken rhythms aloud and how you translated that in. I'm curious just on a kind of like nitty gritty practical level how that translates.
Yeah. So I got into him because my dad had this quote on his high school yearbook photo of this quatrain that I was interested in, and it was something like, yeah, it's the focus is yesterday's 7,000 years, and I think that's a reference to, I think that's a biblical reference, if I'm not mistaken. But I feel like the purpose of the quatrain is basically like you should enjoy life because we don't have a lot of time here. So,
Mm.
um, and then so I started reading the Rubaiyat, and when I was at McDowell, which is where I was, that's a sort of artist residency in New Hampshire, and I was there right after my dad died. I almost didn't go, and then when I was there, a lot of people who were there, there were dancers and visual artists and journalists and authors. And they were like, you should read these poetry books. I think it'll really help you. And I was like, no, I don't want to. And then I was thinking about, oh yeah, my dad with this poet. And so then I went and found online, some translations of the Rubaiyat. And I mean, I know it's originally sort of written in probably in Farsi or something like that. So me reading these quatrains out loud in English is probably not exactly how they really sounded. But I wasn't about to try to go through that,
Right.
learning language and like trying to hear it and stuff.
Mhm.
But yeah, it was almost like, okay, I'm gonna do this routine every day, read aloud from the thing, and it was calming to me. It was a little therapeutic, and it sort of allowed me to think I'm connecting with my dad or a past version of my dad through this portal. And so it became that idea of a portal came right then, and that was like that's the name of my record, and that's going to be the name of the next record too because my grandmother was a poet.
Hmm.
So that's also another sort of sideline to all of this because she was a poet. She started writing poetry later in life, probably in her 50s and maybe 40s, and more professionally in her 40s and 50s. But I feel like maybe she started earlier. But her poems, they were okay. There's a few that are really good, and I've sort of pulled those out. But the idea for the next record is that I'm kind of attempting to talk with her through this portal of trying to understand why she didn't maybe go deeper into certain emotional and physical ideas because she went through the war in England, and so there are little glimpses of that pain, but she didn't really put it very harshly into her work. And so
Hmm.
I'm just, why didn't you do that? And that's my portal with her. But my portal with my father was like, how can I really enjoy life? And so the poetry aspect of really getting lewd or just kind of enjoying like the lewdness of life. With Omar Khayyam, he kind of talks about always like drinking wine and like enjoying yourself and like I don't know, I just kind of imagine him laying somewhere really sort of like the lewdness and sexuality and just
Hmm.
being a part of the life and having a good time. And that part of it for me was, why I was enjoying that poetry at that moment because I just had to be that way through
Hmm.
the so, and then the rhythmic stuff, yeah, sometimes I would get stuck on a quatrain or a phrase. I would get stuck on a phrase, and so I would just say, yesterday, 7,000 years, yesterday, 7,000 years, yesterday, 7,000 years. And that could be something for me to translate to a piece. And sometimes for those days I was there, I would just repeat some of those rhythms. And that's very therapeutic, repeating rhythms.
Hmm.
As we know from drum circles and other, candomblé ceremony, all these kinds of ceremonies that ancient healers go through when they're practicing their art form and their healing form of life. So that was sort of the way I went about that. And so then I would record myself and I took some of those phrases to put in this piece, Yesterday, 7,000 Years.
Interesting. When I read the thing about speaking aloud and sort of like taking the rhythm from that, I thought of like Henry Hayes' like hilarious transcriptions of political stuff. If you've heard that,
Yeah, yeah, the George W. Bush. That one, I
yeah, it's
remember the George W.
incredible.
Bush one from years ago when we all hated George W. Bush. And now we were replaced with someone more awful, but
Yeah,
but yeah, his stuff is really great. And there's a handful of other people like Mono Neon.
mhm,
I,
yeah,
he does that and his are really great. I love how he'll take commercials of people talking or news clips from the
yeah.
news. Oh man, they're so good. Really good.
Hearing your record though, it doesn't seem like that's quite your approach. Maybe it's a little bit more gestural or something.
It's more gestural and it has to do with sort of accent structure.
Okay.
So that kind of pulling out that stuff. And for that piece, Yesterday 7,000 Years, you'll hear kind of like this, it's an angular melody. And so like some of the notes pop out. And that's, for me, that was where the emphasis came from, sort of that lilting feeling that we get from reading poetry, or any rap music for that matter.
Hmm. This is kind of a stupid question, but since we're talking about like sort of the mood that you're conveying with the album, I'm curious if you're familiar with the Australian death metal band Portal.
Oh no, actually.
It's
I should check them out.
literally it's the most terrifying sounding music I've ever heard. Like it's I don't know how they do it, but it's like four horror movies layered on top of each other. It's very interesting, but yeah, they're great, but crazy. And
From
the lead singer
Australia?
has like, sorry.
Australia? Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, and the lead singer wears a clock on his head a lot of the time. It's called the
Wow.
Curator. It's a big trip. It's weird stuff, but
Like the
just
whole
wanted.
clock on top of his head or just covering his face?
Yeah, it's like a clock mask that goes up like this.
Wow, I really have to check this out.
It's
Thank
a yeah, it's
you.
very performative.
Nice. I
Very
love that
theatrical.
stuff. And I'm actually working to do some of that performative. I started working on that at McDowell 2 years ago, but in 2019. But I'm working on a bit of the theatrical component of working with these materials and textures, playing solo. So I love that. I love the idea of that.
Mhm. Uh, let's see here. So I'm also curious. Like this is a much larger ensemble than I'm used to doing. Like you mentioned Alula, and that's like I absolutely love that record. And I love how it's like so bare bones. But this is like it has like a string quartet, it has piano, it has. So I'm curious if that's something that's like natural for you, or if, like what that progression from like a tiny ensemble to a larger ensemble is like for you as a orchestrator and a composer.
Yeah, I mean, this was my first time writing extensively for strings, and so I had to go into a few books to check out all of the range and what's possible, trying my best at writing things and talking to people. Is this possible? Can I do this? And a lot of the times I was looking for certain sounds and textures, and so learning the right language for that, learning the right Italian language for that, the musical tradition. But yeah, it takes so much longer, I would say, to write for the larger ensemble if you're looking to have all the parts sort of be independent. And I was looking for a combination of the independence and this is a string quartet, but this is also a string quart. This is not a string quartet. This is like four extra components to this quintet that I've been working with for a couple years now. So that was really for me. I wasn't like, let me hire a string quartet and have them be in addition to this thing. I want
Hmm.
all of this to be integrated into the mix of things.
Hmm.
Um, and so, yeah, it was a challenge because I felt like I worked out a lot of the seeds of ideas, and I was like, okay, what would sound the best with this profile of frequency? Like, okay, I mean, let's give this to the cello and like the viola together, or let's give this to the cello and the violin because I kind of want, the sandwich, so high and low have the same part, but then the middle are paired with the saxophone and the trumpet. So yeah, it takes longer, and um, the orchestrating, I had to take a week sort of away to get everything written in the right way. So I went to the
And
beach, wrote there.
oh, nice. It, I mean, it sounds like there's some improvised parts as well for them. Is the ensemble of string people that you chose, are they all sort of comfortable improvising, or is that something that you like, sort of like, hey, try this?
Yeah, I chose all of those musicians because of how incredible they are at improvising.
Awesome.
So I wanted that to be a big part of it rather than, you could go the other route, which is extremely, I think this way to go is also like really great. But you could get a string quartet that's, have been working together for years and they have an established name and they can nail the parts and everything is going to sound perfect. And that is a wonderful method of doing things as well, because then they have an ensemble, um, sort of, they have a collaborative aspect they've been sort of honing in on for a long time. But instead of that, I sort of was like, I would rather just kind of like pick and choose my favorite improvisers and put them on here because I
Mhm.
really care more about the improvising. I would say
Right.
I care more about the improvising than I do the parts, you know?
Hmm.
Um, so, because I think that's the most exciting part about making music is the improvising. So yeah, I just
Totally.
chose Joanna is an incredible violist who I've heard and played with before and had always wanted to work with her. Mariel Roberts, I had worked with her in the Lee Conant Sonnet, but she wasn't improvising in that context. But I kind of heard her, writing her own music and improvising in her own ways. And I was like, wow, I really want to work with her. Maz Swift, I've known for a long time, but we hadn't had the chance to work together. And I'm just a complete fan of hers in terms of her improvising and her music. And the person I knew the least, but is also really incredible, is Josh Henderson. And he's been touring with so many different projects over the years. And I had seen some videos of him and been like, I really want to work with him. So I was really happy all of them could do it.
Hmm. Awesome. I mean, it definitely sounds like it doesn't sound like a string quartet was tagged on. Like it sounds like it was integrated. Like it sounds like you were trying to do so. That's
Yeah.
nice. Let's see here. I'm curious. So, like the oscillation series that you've been doing on Instagram is really interesting. And like, I actually just saw right before this. I was like, I looked at the first one. I was like, oh, 3 against 2. Those were the days. Versus like 8 against 9 against 7.
Yeah.
And like that's a pretty interesting woodshed to like have on display for people. And I'm curious if like that like what else does your woodshed look like sort of for like musicians that are interested in practicing a lot and being good. Is there anything that you can share that's sort of maybe inspiring or intriguing to us?
Yeah. I mean, I do the same um, maintenance that I think a lot of horn players do, which is I do long tones. I mean, my practice sessions are about 2 hours a day, and I do long tones for like usually 20 minutes. I'll do long tones, and I'll try to do that when my partner's not around because it's loud. And luckily we live not surrounded by people, so that's good. I mean, there are people still in the building, but we're kind of on the top floor and no one's around on all the sides, but just below. So that's good. So I do the long tones and I work on overtones on the saxophone. I work on technical exercises. I'm working on this Warren Marsh. I don't know if anyone's seen the book A Jazz Life, and it's written by one of Warren Marsh's previous students, um, whose name is John, I feel like Kakowski or something like that. Um, and I have to look that up. But anyway, he wrote this book and he included all these exercises that Warren Marsh gave him to practice. And so I'm practicing some of those technical exercises, and some of them are really easy, like anyone could do them. I think the one I'm working on now is do 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 do, that in time and with the metronome, and then you invert it. Like you just invert it when you come down. So that's that. And I work on those technical exercises for like 20 minutes also a day. And sometimes the technical exercises take the form of an etude. So I was working on the Paganini flute etudes, but just not transposing them and working on them as they would be played in the same fingering style as a flute, but on saxophone. Let's see, and then I usually work on oscillations for 20 to 25 minutes a day because it's just a daily practice for me. So I'll work on really essentially it's these polyrhythms, but they're played inharmonically. So I'm playing them. They're not played harmonically like at the same time. So
Right. Okay.
going back and forth between them. So that's why I'm saying inharmonically. But and then the rest of the hour, the other hour is improvising. So I'm working on 3 sections, so 20 minutes each of a different idea. So right now I'm working on a solo set, so I'm working with my electronics, and so loop station and sampler, and I also have the audio game changer plus pedal, which is really like a sustain pedal, so you can play chords for yourself. And then I have my line 6 pedal, so I'm sort of practicing that for the whole hour. But usually it'll be like, okay, I'm practicing this song for 20 minutes and improvising over that structure. Or I'm using this rhythm that's, 15 beats, and I'm trying to practice within this 15 beat rhythm for 20 minutes. And I'm improvising with that and making sure that I'm staying within the beat structure of 15 beats, which is hard.
Mm-hmm.
And then for the other 20 minutes, maybe I'll play over a tune or something like a jazz canon tune. I was just working on Nobody Else But Me the other day for 20 minutes. And so that's pretty much what my practice sessions look like.
Nice. It's funny, when I was listening to Portals, I did hear a 15. I think there's a 15 somewhere in there, right?
Probably.
Yeah, and I was just kind of jealous because like I remember being in college, I'm in Los Angeles, and like I would put like an 11 somewhere, and people would just be like, yeah, we aren't going to play with you anymore. And so I'm like, is this just like a New York thing where people are willing to do this out there? Like,
I mean, it's possible. I feel like if you keep searching, you can find people who are willing to do that anywhere. I feel like maybe there's just more people out here. It might just be that. I mean, there's so many people here. So I think it really just comes down to more people willing to.
mm-hmm.
And less people willing to. But I feel like you can find people if you keep looking anywhere. I mean, anywhere you live.
I'm just making an excuse for why people don't want to play with me. You also, like, it sounds like you bring in outside influences like like anatomy, neuroscience, psychology, and like I'm curious, I read that the Alula wing is like this locomotive part of the wing structure, and so I just generally like birds and like ornithology, and like there are a bunch of crazy birds in my neighborhood that I am just like, whoa. There's actually like a parrot across the street that is very well trained, that is always going crazy. And so I'm just curious how you sort of incorporate things from like the world of birds into compositions.
Yeah, that album, and at that time of my life, I was trying to get. I'm so bad. I feel like sometimes I try to get into things, and then I'm really excited about it, and then I just don't. But I was reading the Sibley Guide to Birds, which for people who want to. It's kind of a basic book for people who want to get into bird watching, and I'm like, I'm going to get into bird watching, and I have not gotten to bird watching, so I need to get a set of binoculars. And I need to actually go to a bird watching class, which they have some in the park that's right next to where I live. So I have no excuse. But I was reading about this Alula structure with these, the series of bones and feathers. And I was like, wow, what an interesting feather that sort of like pops out. And you see it like, and you see it in these pictures of birds that are, landing or taking off or gliding. You see this little popped up group of feathers in the bone sort of there, and you're like, that's the Alula. That's there to control the process of taking off and landing and gliding. And it's just there for that. Otherwise, actually, when you read about that structure in other books, they call it the bastard wing because it's
Mm.
like this thing that's not necessarily like needed. I'm like, this is so offensive, this word, and like the way that, anyway, the way people think about this. So anyway, I started reading some papers and that were way above my head, but I was like, I'm determined to read about what this structure does, and like, okay, this is the Alula on like the grackle, and like what happens with this, on the Alula of like a hawk. Why is it different? How is it different? How is the math different? So then I started focusing on one bird, and I took a lot of the numbers from the ratio between the bones and the feather, and I use those in like the one song Wing Beat, to write. I use like certain number of pitches in the top voice versus a certain number of pitches in the low voice, and that was like the inspiration for using that math in that composition. And then in other places, I was using some of the other ratios that I found in these papers. I really literally took the ratio and then was like, oh, how could I write something based on? It's very simple. I just took the numbers and like, okay, this number of pitches, or I took the numbers and I made a rhythm based out of the ratio. So it's a simple thing anybody could do. But yeah, so to me it's always helpful to bring something else from outside of music in. It makes things more interesting for me, to especially for writing, you know.
Mhm. I spoke with David Rothenberg. I don't know, I can't say his name. David Rothenberg, and he's like done these collaborations with cicadas and stuff, and like part of
Wow.
that is like the whole 17-year cycle. And so I'm curious, as somebody who's like engaged on a creative level, like, do you have any sense of why somebody would like, or why an insect would emerge only 17 years, like prime number? Like, is there any sort of like interesting thing to you in that realm, like
Yeah, it's funny.
17-year cycles?
Yeah, it's funny you should mention David Rothenberg because I was just ordering the Why Birds Sing book. I'm really interested. I mean, I'm starting to try to maybe get back into the um, idea of like working with birds because I really want to do another Alula record. So I'm he's an inspiration. So that's so cool that you were able to talk with him, and I look forward to seeing that. Um, but yeah, I started sort of getting, and we were talking a little, or you were talking a little bit about this when you were writing to me, but like these different cycles, the like ultradian and like circadian rhythms,
Hmm.
um and so, but I haven't really yeah, with David's stuff, that sounds like he's more applying it to like when they come back around, when they appear again, right? Is that right?
Yeah, I think he just gets to put on an album with them as a guest every 17 years. So
Wow, that's so funny. Oh my gosh. Yeah, but yeah, the idea of, yeah, like the ultradian rhythms and circadian rhythms, and how we're kind of not perceptive of them. And even also, I know you have done work and we're talking about sort of menstrual cycles too people who identify as females and who have that anatomy, and just sort of being, I mean, some people very aware of that and how it
mhm.
maybe also interacts with cycles of the moon. I know I've talked to a lot of people about that, and some people just kind of not being aware, like, oh, I was total, or maybe their cycles are more erratic, so they are always surprised by when it comes through. But
Mhm.
it's interesting to me to think about, because in music we're always dealing with shorter cycles of time
Right.
and space. But yeah, it's interesting to me to think about the longevity of that, like waiting for the 19-year cycle to start again, or like
Yeah.
what happens in that resting time.
Hmm.
It's interesting to me to think about, and I don't really know a lot about it, and um I'm just interested to know how we can be more aware of those things, or how
Hmm.
the natural idea of the cycle coming back around, or us wanting that to come back around, could be something that we could be attuned to. But you should tell me about your work a little bit because I know you were like talking about that.
Well, yeah, I guess like I've been interested in this idea of like, I'm calling it meta music, even though everybody says meta everything, and so I don't have a better name for it other than like macroscopic music. But like I've been like interested in like sort of like cryptocurrencies and like seeing like these like waveforms, and it's like this is very musical, and like nobody wants to see it like that because they're like it has to do with money and economics. But it's like it's a big old waveform, and I'm just like this is like a melody that is just only going to be heard by a giant who like isn't really on our sense of time. Or actually, like talking to you, David Rothenberg, you mentioned like whales and like how they have this vocalization where you hear it as a human, and you're like, okay, so it's like every once in a while, but then you speed it up and you see that's exactly in rhythm, and so it's like whoa, like they just have a sense of rhythm that's slowed way down.
Wow,
Yeah,
that's so cool. What's
and
the
so
time? How much does he have to speed it up?
I think I think it comes up every 2 minutes or so, and so like when you speed it up, by 120, that's like every second. Um,
Wow, I wonder if they feel subdivisions. And so that's like my next question is because when I was just teaching this workshop at UConn, I was talking about practicing. I had been practicing at 5 beats per minute. And I put the metronome on and I was like, this is five. And I was like, this is so hard, you know? I mean,
yeah,
10 started getting easier for me now, but it's because I'm subdividing, you know? And five gets easier because I'm subdividing. So, but to feel five naturally is so insane.
totally. And yeah, to go back to the menstrual cycle thing, like it makes no sense to talk about it in terms of hertz, but it's like 0.00000 something hertz, and like it doesn't make sense to put in those terms. So I think that's kind of interesting because it's like there is some sort of dynamic regularity to it, and like our like calendar months are like it's like that's like New York person time signatures that LA people aren't going to be willing to deal with, like 29 this time, 31 this time, like really complicated. But like a human biological cycle is, I feel like it has like the ability to entrain and do all this interesting stuff. And so I feel like there's something musical in there that people aren't seeing, um just because I guess we aren't big enough to like be timeless that way, you know. But
Yeah. Yeah, I really wonder about these things in terms of
um
subdivision and how we feel it naturally.
with
I,
the cicada thing in the 17 years, like I was asking him why that's the case, and I think there are a few different theories, and like part of it was like since 17 is a prime number, it like gets out of phase with other predator cycles, and so it might have them some sort of survival instinct. But then he said like, oh no, these Japanese scientists have figured this out now, and like it's probably the best of the three options of what it is. But I don't know, it's just kind of interesting. Like it makes me interested then in prime numbers, and there's a lot of interesting sort of non-musical stuff to be like influenced by there.
right, because and because the biological rhythms will also influence like your metabolism and your heart rate
Hmm.
and hormone levels and how much you go to the bathroom and like your body temperature and your blood
Hmm.
pressure and heart rate. It's all connected to those rhythms are connected to the other biological rhythms that are in the body. So there must be another frequency component. Absolutely. Absolutely. Whether that frequency component is perceived as a beating in time or if it's a frequency that I mean, there must be a frequency because there's frequency in everything.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
I feel like there's some sort of new age territory to go down here, but I
That's
won't. Um,
I mean,
so
I'm into it. I'm into all that stuff. My dad was really into seeing different kinds of healers, but I'm really into that way of looking at the world. But I think a lot of people are skeptical of it because they don't perceive it. They don't perceive frequency. So it's like
mhm.
people who put their face or they're standing in front of the microwave. I don't know if you've like a lot of parents are like, don't stand in front of the microwave. There's these like harmful waves that can influence your can I don't know, influence your body and like your brain. It's like, no, you can't see them.
Mhm.
I don't know. I don't remember Remember when microwaves weren't safe, you know?
Right, yeah. And it's funny, I heard from somebody who's like a big anti-aging person that like actually it's like the best way to cook food or something. So I'm like, I don't know what to believe anymore.
Wow.
Yeah, so
I
I
know. I know. Because actually, I just don't have a microwave. Funny enough, because we just heat food up on the stove and there's not room for it. So anyway,
mhm,
I
totally
don't
yeah.
hate microwaves.
Neither do I. Yeah. um,
If you want to
it's,
use a microwave, you can use a microwave. Anyway, sorry. Moving on.
um, well, we're getting up on an hour, so I don't want to take up too much of your time. But I'm curious. You know, you have a PhD in music cognition. That's correct, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Hmm.
so I'm somebody that's like sort of interested in like eventually going into maybe not music cognition per se, but like some sort of nearby field. And I'm wondering if there's any sort of like big picture or bird's eye view wisdom that you can give me or other people.
Yeah, totally. So music cognition sort of came out of work of many different researchers over hundreds of years. I mean, we can go back to like Aristotle, and I mean, we can go back to some of the philosophers, Plato, who were already kind of studying music back then, Socrates, and the idea of like the music of the planets.
Mhm.
Um, and then kind of moving forward into like enlightenment and people looking more into the body. Helmholtz was a really wonderful researcher, sort of in the 19th century, who was involved with looking at cochlea structure
Mm.
and also studying consonance and dissonance. Um, and then I think a lot of people started getting together and collecting all of this work and sort of saying like, what could we start a new, I mean, it wasn't like there was a meeting, but I feel like a lot of people sort of at the same time were starting programs and inside of either music departments or psychology departments and calling those programs, you know, cognitive science of music or music cognition or whatever. So I just sort of like gave you a fast description of what how it came about. But there were also acousticians who were interested in acoustics only, so physicists and the perception of frequency and time-based things like Al Bregman is a big one for if you're
Mm.
taking like an intro to
That's like
music cognition class.
it's like auditory scene analysis, or is that
Yes,
somebody with a
exactly.
similar name? Okay.
That's it. That's him. Yeah. So he, you know, was really interested in Gestalt psychology,
Mm.
sort of this like German model of how we organize the world and how we parse things out, and why are these sounds sounding like a melody when it's really like one musician playing them, and you know, it's because it's sort of separated by enough space. So it's like the law of proximity or the law of
Mm.
whatever it is. All these different like Gestalt laws, and he sort of applied some of that to the sound realm. Anyway, so there's people like that. Or Carol Krumhansel is a very big person who looks at um, pitch profiles. So like why she kind of put things on the map, like how do people organize a tonal system? And she did all these experiments and showed that like octaves were important to understanding like the one chord, or tonal harmony has to do with the four and the five chords, or if you're into the Roman numeral analysis. And Diana Deutsch was really interested in like um, auditory illusion. So why do we hear certain things in this way? So she looked at the tritone paradox, and so there's all these people kind of coming together from different aspects of psychology and music. And I would say that there are some really great programs around, including the one that I went to at Northwestern, which is
Mm.
housed in the music theory department. And also, there is an interesting place to be because Nina Kraus is in sort of the neuroscience and acoustics lab over there, auditory neuroscience lab. And she does a lot of work with music, and her work is important to understanding how out there there's sound, but actually in here the sound looks almost identical. So somehow we have this transcription process that allows us to hear exactly what's
Mm.
going on out there and record what the brain is hearing. It looks like the profiles are almost identical, and that's amazing. You know, she kind of, and she's done a lot of other things too, but so Northwestern is a really interesting place because you can kind of be like, all right, I'm a musician, I could get this degree, but I also could go over here to the auditory neuroscience people and work with them in their lab. Um, And I worked with a really wonderful cognitive scientist there named Doug Medine, who was interested in culture and how people organize information based on their cultural upbringing. And that was
Hmm.
my dissertation work. So I feel
Interesting.
like if you're going into that field, if you're interested in pairing cognition or neuroscience or acoustics or physics with music, I feel like the way to go is you find a researcher or a group of researchers that is exciting and interesting to you, and you find out a lot of the times they're teaching at universities. You find out where they're at, and you go and you study with them, and
Okay.
that's sort of what I did. And I think that's a really great way to get involved because the field is small, um, and it has very many kind of outlets. And there's a lot of people in Europe and Japan and Korea. I have a good friend who teaches music cognition in Korea and Australia. There's a bunch of people studying there in Glasgow and Scotland. There's Raymond McDonald who studies improvising and group dynamics. There's Jane Davidson who used to be in England or used to be in Australia and now is in England. She studies group dynamics and gender. So there's people sort of everywhere, but I feel like is the idea of like a program that's going to encapsulate everything won't be the case. So if
Okay.
that's helpful in any, I think you got to find like it's kind of like going to music school where you want to study with a certain person, and so you go to that school because you want to study with Nadia Boulanger or you want to study with Stravinsky at at this university in California that he's teaching at or something. But
Mhm.
it's a similar kind of rule for music cognition. So,
So
and then
seek
there's
out
also
like a
music.
mentor.
Yeah, and there's music therapy too, and that's a more clinical approach. And there are many music therapy programs out there. I know there's one, I think at Temple, that a good friend of mine went to, and they're all over the place. There's a good music cognition program or people kind of working in that realm of music theory at the University of Texas, North Texas. Um, there's some people at Ann Arbor, Northwestern. There's in Montreal, a really wonderful group of people. There's other people in Canada, Sandra Tree Hub. Yeah, there's tons of people. So yeah, you kind of just have to find who you're into and what you're into because the
Mhm.
field is very big. And like if you want to study babies and how babies, you know, uh, navigate the world, then you find those people and you go there to do that. So hopefully that's
Is,
helpful to
yeah,
anyone.
yeah, totally, absolutely. Is there anything that you sort of wish that you knew in retrospect to inform your own sort of education on that path?
I mean, I don't have regrets, I guess. I when I got my PhD, I came straight from an undergraduate program where the lab I worked in, I got a psychology degree. And I worked for a wonderful researcher named Ira Bernstein who introduced me to music cognition. And he encouraged me. And I was like, I really want to pursue this. So I applied to a few different universities and I was really applying to a master's degree, and then Northwestern offered me the PhD program, and so I was like, let's go for it.
Nice.
Chicago's cool. Um, I love the research that's happening at Northwestern and the people there, so I wanted to go for that. And yeah, I would say that I followed that path of finding the researchers who I was really interested in working with, and staying in touch with all of the other people through conferences and networking. Um, yeah. I would say also some advice that I did myself, but is definitely go to the conferences. There's like the
Okay.
International ICMPC, International Conference for Music Perception and Cognition. There's SMPC, Society for Music Perception and Cognition. There's all sorts of organizations that hold conferences. So if you want to get a sense of the field, that's a good place to start and or to understand where you might fit in. Because there would be a whole panel on babies, for example, or there's a whole panel on dissonance, or there's a whole panel on
Hmm.
physics, or maybe a whole day on acoustics and physics.
Hmm.
So yeah, and then you find your people, just like any other kind of realm of work in life. I would say also one thing that is hard to see is, and just from a social justice kind of standpoint, I would like to see just more representation of different
Hmm.
kinds and diversity of researchers. So there's not a lot of people of color. There are a good amount of women in the field and people who identify not as male and But yeah, I would say the diversity in terms of race and culture is pretty bad. But I
Mm.
hope that will change. I hope that will change.
Mhm. Cool.
Yeah.
Well, I guess I'll let you go. Is there anything else that you want to talk about real quick before we sign off?
Not really. I feel like we talked about a
Yeah,
lot. And yeah, if there's any questions, I'm always available for anyone to contact, and I always loved having these conversations. And I love collaborating with people on projects or collaborate. I've started thinking about collaborating with people to write certain things in terms of text, not music. But well, I love collaborating with people writing music too. But
hmm,
anyway, I've started to think about that. Like, what does it look like to pass back and forth things out there in cyberspace of writing
totally.
about certain philosophical aspects of life or scientific aspects of life, and to find a community of people to, and I've been doing that through Instagram and my website, just writing blurbs that I'm interested in, asking questions because I'm really
Hmm.
interested in how people think about these things. People out there. I hate the word lay people, so I'm trying to think about a different term. People out there is my word.
I've previously said that this podcast has no interest in appeasing the layperson, but uh, I think that this will appease all people. This conversation. Um, so I should mention also that we talked mostly about portals and a little bit about Alula, but you also have like a ton of other new music out that I sort of glossed over because I just wanted to talk about like the newer album. But yeah, everybody should check it out. Bandcamp, your website, Instagram, all that.
Yeah, it's
Um,
such a good time to support artists because we're still kind of like jump starting life. Still, we're
totally.
still in the middle of the pandemic and still a lot of injustice out there. So keep supporting artists, everybody, as much as you
Yeah,
can.
absolutely. Cool. Well, Caroline Davis,
Thank
thanks so much for talking to me. This was a great conversation, and I'll talk to you in the future, hopefully.
thank you so much, John.
Yeah, I'll talk to you later.
Awesome. Yeah.